I am Macie Carver, 32 years old, a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force. I am used to taking orders, but I never thought the cruelest command would come from my own mother. Exactly at 6:47 p.m. on a Sunday afternoon, 5 days before Thanksgiving, my mother called. She did not ask how I was doing after my training rotation, but instead coldly announced a sanction. Vivian is bringing her billionaire boyfriend home to meet us. Do not come. Your coarse, rigid military look will ruin the feng shui of this luxury party. She said that while wearing the pearl earrings I bought with my own hazard pay. They think I am just a failed daughter, a government employee not worthy of sitting at the table with the elite. But they have no idea that in the military footlocker under my bed, there is a computer controlling the $15.2 million lifeline of their entire family. If you have ever been treated like a human ATM by your family only to be pushed to the sidelines because you are not glamorous enough, please leave a comment and let me know what time you are listening to this story. It is time I taught them a lesson about true value. The smell of cleaner lubricant and preservative mixed with the sharp scent of boot polish is the only fragrance that has ever truly made me feel at peace. It is a scent of discipline, of order, and of a life where every action has a clear and measurable purpose. It was 6:40 p.m. on a Sunday evening, and the light in my modest off-base apartment was beginning to fade into a soft, dusty orange. I was sitting at my small kitchen table, my back straight by habit, and my hands moving with the rhythmic precision of a technician. I had just returned from a grueling 14-day training rotation in the desert, and every bone in my 32-year-old body felt like it had been ground into the sand. Yet as I carefully wiped the lint from my stripes and polished the silver on my uniform, I felt a rare sense of anticipation. Thanksgiving was only 5 days away. For most people, it is just a day for turkey and football. But for a technical sergeant in the United States Air Force who spent most of her 20s on deployments, it was the one day a year I allowed myself to believe I belonged somewhere other than a flight line. I had already written out my grocery list. I was going to make the green bean casserole my father loved, the one with the extra crispy onions on top. I could almost taste the warmth of the family kitchen, a place I had supported with every hazard paycheck and every re-enlistment bonus I had ever earned. I was the dependable one, the daughter who never asked for anything and always provided everything. The sudden vibration of my phone on the wooden table felt like a physical jolt to my nervous system. The caller ID simply read, "Mom." I felt a smile touch my lips, a rare and fragile thing. I picked up the phone thinking she was calling to ask what time my flight or drive would bring me into town. I started to say, "Hello, Mom. I just got back from the range," but Patricia Carver did not let me finish. There was no warmth in her voice, no inquiry about my well-being after 2 weeks of sleeping in the dirt. Instead, there was the sharp clicking sound of her tongue against her teeth, a sound she only made when she was calculating the social value of a situation. She told me to listen carefully because the plans for Thanksgiving had changed significantly. My sister Vivian was coming home, but she was not coming alone. She was bringing Derek Hartwell, the man Mom described as the crown jewel of the East Coast elite. Mom spent the next 3 minutes reciting his resume as if it were a holy scripture, mentioning that he was the chief executive officer of Hartwell Capital and that he personally managed over $400 million. I sat there in the silence of my apartment, listening to my mother worship at the altar of a stranger's net worth while I held a uniform that represented 12 years of service to my country. Then came the order that felt like a bayonet to the ribs. My mother told me that she wanted the evening to be perfect and that she had spent thousands of dollars on catering and decor to match Derek's refined tastes. She said that to be perfectly honest, my presence would be a complication. She used the words coarse and rigid to describe my personality as if my military service were a disease I had contracted. She told me that Derek belonged to the true elite and that he did not need to see a sister who looked like she spent her life in the mud or wearing stiff government clothes. She said my sun-tanned skin and my short, unstyled hair would send the wrong message about the family's status. She concluded by saying that it would be better for everyone if I just stayed at the base. She told me she would tell the family I was on high alert or busy with a secret mission because that sounded more prestigious than the truth. She said these words while I knew she was wearing the pearl earrings I had bought for her with the extra pay I earned while being shot at in a valley half a world away. The betrayal was not just in the exclusion, but in the cold efficiency with which she discarded me as a social liability. The discipline of the Air Force is a double-edged sword. It teaches you how to maintain a flat effect when your world is collapsing. I felt my throat tighten and my eyes burn, but I refused to let a single tear fall onto the uniform I had worked so hard to keep clean. I did not argue. I did not beg for a seat at the table I had helped pay for. I simply used the two words that had defined my adult life. Roger that. I hung up the phone, and the silence that followed was heavier than any ruck I had ever carried. I looked at the green bean casserole recipe on the counter and then at the polished brass of my rank. For a moment, I felt the crushing weight of being the glass child, the one who is invisible because she is strong enough to not need fixing. But then the pain began to sharpen into something else, something cold and analytical. I stood up and my knees cracked from years of hard landings. I walked over to the bed and knelt on the floor, reaching into the dark space underneath. I pulled out my heavy steel footlocker, the one that had traveled with me to 3 different continents. I entered the complex 16-digit encryption code into the keypad on the front of the locker. The heavy tumblers clicked open, and I lifted the lid. Inside, past the old letters and the medals I never wore, was a slim black laptop that never left my sight. I opened it, and the glow of the screen illuminated the dark room with a clinical blue light. I navigated through 3 layers of security until I reached a folder labeled Eleanor. My grandmother Eleanor had been the only person in the Carver bloodline who understood that wealth without character was just a fancy cage. When she died, she bypassed my mother and my father, leaving everything in a private trust that only I controlled. As the administrator of the Eleanor Carver Trust, I looked at the updated balance on the screen. The total net value of the assets, including the very house my mother was currently redecorating, stood at exactly $15,200,000. My mother and Vivian were busy auditioning for a billionaire's approval, not realizing that the daughter they had just banned from the dinner table was the one who owned the chairs they were sitting on. I closed the laptop and felt a strange sense of calm descend over me. They wanted a prestigious story about why I was not there. I was going to give them a reality check they would never forget. The blue light of my laptop screen felt like a cold compress on a feverish wound as I sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment. I scrolled through the digital records of my own exploitation, a ledger of a life spent being used and then discarded like a piece of faulty equipment. The numbers did not lie, even if my mother did. I looked at the transaction from last June, $3,000 for an engagement party for my sister Vivian. Vivian, who had never held a steady job in her life, was celebrated with a gala I paid for using my hazard pay from a desert deployment. Then there was the $20,500 I wired to my father, Harold, to repair his vintage mahogany boat. He told me it was a family investment, yet I watched from a distance through social media as he took Vivian and her socialite friends out for sunset cruises, never once suggesting that his eldest daughter might like to feel the spray of the ocean on her face. My family had come to view my paycheck as communal property, a reward for my solitude and my supposedly low cost of living in the barracks. They assumed because I did not have a husband or a mortgage, my life was an empty vessel they were entitled to fill with their own demands. The sting of the recent call from my mother forced a flood of older, deeper memories to the surface. I remembered being 10 years old and standing in the driveway with grease on my forehead, because I was the one tasked with helping my father fix the lawnmower or change the oil in the cars. Inside the house, I could hear the delicate piano music from Vivian's private lessons and the soft laughter of my mother as she fitted Vivian for another expensive ballet tutu. I was the daughter of dirt and labor, the one whose hands were expected to be calloused so that Vivian's could remain soft. They called me masculine and coarse as a way to justify their lack of affection, turning my strength into a reason to withhold their love. It was that very exclusion that drove me to the recruiter's office the moment I turned 18. I did not join the Air Force just for the GI Bill or the sense of duty. I joined because the military was the only place that promised to judge me by the stripes on my sleeve rather than the grace of my walk. But even as I built a life of discipline and honor, I stayed tethered to them by a misplaced sense of loyalty that only one person truly understood. My grandmother Eleanor was the only one in the Carver bloodline who saw through the charade of my mother's social climbing. In the final weeks of her life, when her breath was shallow and her eyes were clouded, she called me to her bedside and dismissed the rest of the family. She gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me and told me that Vivian had never been forced to fight for a single thing in her life. My grandmother knew that without a steady hand, the family fortune would be incinerated in 5 years by Vivian's vanity and my mother's greed. She told me I had the cold head and the warm heart of a soldier. And that was why she was entrusting me with everything. She secretly established the Eleanor Carver Trust and named me the sole trustee with absolute power. I opened an old email from my attorney, Margaret Caldwell, which contained the formal language of my grandmother's final wishes. The document stated clearly that Macie Carver has the sole discretion to determine the timing and amount of any disbursements to Vivian Carver, based on an assessment of her maturity and financial responsibility. For 5 years, I have been a soft-hearted guardian, releasing funds whenever my mother called with a crisis or whenever Vivian had a new dream she wanted to chase. I did it to keep the peace, to feel like I was still a part of the family I so desperately wanted to love me. I allowed them to treat me like a servant while I was secretly their benefactor. But today, as I stared at the digital records of my own sacrifice, I realized that the peace I was buying was a lie. My mother had not just excluded me from a dinner, she had weaponized my own identity against me to appease a billionaire stranger. The Stoic philosophy I had studied during long nights on watch taught me that the best revenge is to not be like those who performed the injury. I would not be cruel, but I would be just. I would no longer be the invisible foundation for their house of cards. My mother wanted the evening to be perfect for her elite guests, and she wanted to pretend that her eldest daughter was an inconvenient soldier far away on a mission. I would give her exactly what she asked for. I would stay away, but the financial life support that kept their luxury lifestyle breathing was about to be restricted. They had forgotten that the person they shoved into the shadows was the one holding the keys to the lights. The era of my silence was over, and the era of accountability was about to begin. I remember sitting in that quiet apartment and realizing that for years I had been paying for the very hands that were now pushing me away. It is a heavy feeling to realize you are only valued for what you can give and not for who you are. If you have ever felt like your family only sees you as a walking bank account rather than a human being, I want you to comment the word ATM below. Have you ever lived through this kind of imbalance where you were the one keeping the roof over their heads only to be treated like a stranger? Please hit the like button and share your story. I want to know if I'm the only one who has ever been made to feel invisible in my own home. The sky over the Air Force Base was a bruised shade of violet as the sun began to dip behind the hangar lines, leaving a cold gray mist in its wake. For most people in the country, Thanksgiving was a day defined by the warmth of a crowded kitchen and the chaotic laughter of relatives. But for me this year, it was a lesson in the architecture of silence. I sat in my small apartment just 15 miles away from the house where I grew up, listening to the hum of a microwave that was currently heating a pre-packaged meal. There was no turkey roasting in my oven and no scent of cinnamon or cloves in the air. Instead, the room smelled of the light coat of oil I had used to clean my commemorative rifle cabinet earlier that afternoon. Those rifles were my only true companions today, and unlike my blood relatives, they were consistent and they never made promises they did not intend to keep. I had spent the last several hours meticulously organizing my gear, finding a strange comfort in the order of my equipment. In the military, everything has a place and every action has a reason. My family, however, lived in a world of shifting shadows and hidden agendas. I felt the loneliness not as a sharp pain, but as a dull, heavy pressure in my chest. I had told myself I was fine with being alone. But as I stared at the blinking light of the microwave, I realized that the isolation was not just physical. It was the realization that I was currently being treated as a non-person by the people who shared my last name. At exactly 8:47 p.m., the peace I had tried so hard to build was shattered by a single vibration from my phone. I saw a notification from my sister Vivian, and for a split second, a foolish part of me hoped it was an apology or a late invitation. I opened the message and felt the air leave my lungs as I read her words. She thanked me for holding down the fort at the base and told me that Derek had remarked on how high class and sophisticated our family appeared. She had the audacity to tell me that my decision to stay away was a stroke of genius, because it kept the atmosphere perfect for their billionaire guest. Attached to the message was a high-resolution photograph of the four of them. My father, Harold, my mother, Patricia, Vivian, and Derek were all seated around the heavy mahogany dining table that I had helped pay for 3 years ago. They were laughing and raising glasses of expensive crystal filled with wine that cost more than my monthly housing allowance. There was no empty chair. There was no sign that a fifth member of the family was missing, or even thought of. They looked like a perfect advertisement for a life I was apparently too unrefined to inhabit. I stared at the image on my screen and began to zoom in with the clinical precision I had learned during years of technical analysis. My training as a technician made me notice things others might miss. And as I enlarged the photo, my blood began to turn from ice to fire. I saw my mother smiling broadly, wearing the set of pearl earrings I had purchased for her with the hazard pay I earned during my last deployment to a combat zone. Then my eyes moved to Vivian, who was draped in a luxury cashmere scarf that belonged to me, a gift I had left in my old bedroom for safekeeping. But the true blow came when I looked at the center of the table. Sitting directly in front of Derek Hartwell was a shimmering silver tea set. It was the heirloom that my grandmother Eleanor had specifically promised to me in private, telling me it was the one piece of her history she wanted a woman of my strength to carry forward. My mother had always claimed it was too fragile to be moved and that she was keeping it in a safe deposit box for my future. Yet there it was, being used as a prop to impress a stranger. They had stripped my room of my belongings and my life of my inheritance just to build a stage for their social climbing performance. They were using my money, my gifts, and my legacy to sell a lie to a man who did not even know I existed. The fury that erupted inside me was unlike anything I had ever felt in my 12 years of service. It was a cold, white, hot rage that demanded action. I did not want to cry anymore. I wanted to move. I reached for my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. Rachel Torres, my commanding officer and one of the few people who knew the truth about my family situation, answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened, and I could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Rachel did not offer me platitudes or pity. Instead, she spoke with the authority of a mentor who knew my true value. She reminded me that I was an Echo 6, a technical sergeant who commanded an entire maintenance team. She asked me why I was allowing people who could not even manage their own finances to treat me like a low-ranking private. She told me that my grandmother had given me the weapons I needed for this fight and that it was time to stop being a martyr and start being a leader. Rachel pointed out that if I continued to stay silent, I was effectively giving them permission to keep stealing my life. Her words were like a splash of freezing water to my face. I realized then that my silence was not a virtue. It was a form of cowardice that was feeding their arrogance. After hanging up with Rachel, I walked over to my desk and opened the secure folder on my laptop once again. I navigated past the account balances and went straight to the legal framework of the trust. I scrolled down until I found Section 4.2. My grandmother had been a visionary, and she had included a clause that allowed the trustee to immediately suspend all disbursements if there was evidence of financial mismanagement or a lack of personal integrity by the beneficiaries. For 5 years, I had ignored this section, choosing instead to be the provider who kept the peace. But as I looked at that silver tea set in the photograph, I knew the peace was dead. I was the one who controlled the flow of their entire existence. I was the one who authorized the payments for the very house they were sitting in and the very wine they were drinking. I looked at the clock and realized that the time for being the invisible daughter was over. I stood up and felt a sense of purpose that was as solid as the steel of my service weapon. I was going to give them the holiday they deserved. The counter-operation had officially begun, and by the time I was finished, they would realize that the sister they had discarded was the only thing standing between them and total financial ruin. On Friday morning, the air in downtown Boston was sharp and carried the scent of salt from the harbor as I drove my old Ford F-150 through the narrow, winding streets. My truck was a decade old with faded paint and a few dents from my time moving between bases, but the engine hummed with a reliability that I valued more than any shiny exterior. I pulled into a parking garage near Post Office Square, feeling a strange sense of displacement as I stepped out in my simple attire of charcoal trousers and a crisp white button-down shirt. My hair was pulled back into a tight professional bun, a habit from years of wearing a flight cap. While the people around me were draped in designer labels and hurried toward high-rise offices with an air of self-importance, I walked with the steady, measured pace of someone who had seen much larger things than a stock market dip. I was headed to the offices of Caldwell and Associates to meet with Margaret Caldwell, the woman who had been my grandmother's most trusted confidant and the legal architect of the Eleanor Carver Trust. When I entered the mahogany-paneled lobby, the receptionist looked at my utilitarian clothes and my worn boots with a flicker of hesitation, but that vanished the moment I gave my name. I was ushered immediately into Margaret's private corner office where the 65-year-old lawyer sat behind a desk cluttered with leather-bound volumes and high-end technology. Margaret stood up and greeted me with a warm, genuine smile, a look of deep respect that I had never once received from my own mother. She told me it was good to see me, and commented on how much I reminded her of Eleanor not in appearance, but in the way I held myself with a quiet authority. As we sat down, she placed a thick blue folder on the desk titled Annual Fiduciary Review of the Eleanor Carver Trust. Margaret reminded me that the upcoming Monday was the final deadline for the annual evaluation and the subsequent disbursement of funds to my sister Vivian. Before we delved into the trust, Margaret turned a page in my personal file and looked at me over her reading glasses. She pointed out that I had authorized another anonymous donation of $50,000 to the Beacon Hill Veterans Fund earlier this month. She asked if I was absolutely certain I did not want my name attached to the gift, especially since the organization was planning a major recognition ceremony. I shook my head and told her that the money was meant to provide housing for homeless veterans, not to buy me a seat at a vanity table. I told her that I did what I did for my conscience, and not for applause. Margaret sighed and told me that my humility was a rare thing in a city built on social climbing. She noted the sharp contrast between my quiet generosity and the behavior of my mother Patricia, who she recalled once demanded a press release for a $50 donation to a local garden club. We then shifted our focus to the cold, hard reality of the trust's requirements under Section 4.2. Margaret laid out the specific language my grandmother had insisted upon, which stated that any financial support for Vivian was strictly contingent on a proven record of maturity and financial responsibility. Margaret flipped through a stack of credit card statements and bank records that I had been monitoring for months. We looked at thousands of dollars spent on international first-class travel luxury handbags and a series of failed business ventures that Vivian had abandoned after only a few weeks. Margaret asked me directly if I believed Vivian had met the criteria for the next major disbursement, which was scheduled to be $500,000. I looked at the photos of the lavish Thanksgiving party my mother had sent me the night before, and then back at the records of debt Vivian was accumulating. I told Margaret that based on the evidence, Vivian was not just failing the test, she was treating the trust like a bottomless well. My gaze went cold as I told her that I would not be signing the authorization for the Monday release. As I prepared to leave, Margaret reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope with gold foil embossing. She told me that as the anonymous founding sponsor of the Beacon Hill Winter Gala, the board of directors had sent me a personal invitation for the following evening. She informed me that the event was the premier social gathering of the season, and that ironically, Vivian and her new boyfriend, Derek Hartwell, were listed on the guest list through a corporate table Derek's firm had purchased. My mother and father were also expected to attend as Vivian's guests. Margaret smiled a bit mischievously and said that it might be the perfect time for the trustee to see exactly how the beneficiaries were representing the Carver name in public. I took the envelope and felt the weight of the cardstock in my hands. I remembered Vivian's text message telling me I did not belong at their table because I lacked the prestige to sit with Derek. I thought about my mother telling me I would ruin the atmosphere of her perfect evening with my military rigidity. I told Margaret that Vivian had been right about one thing, which was that I did not have a ticket to the gala. I looked Margaret in the eye and said that I did not need a ticket because I was the one who was paying for the ballroom, the orchestra, and the very champagne they would be drinking. I walked out of that office and into the Boston sunlight, feeling a strange sense of clarity. The family that had discarded me was about to walk into a room where I was the most powerful person in the building, and they had absolutely no idea that the light they were basking in was being provided by the daughter they had left in the dark. It was late Friday afternoon, and the setting sun was casting long, jagged shadows across the hardwood floor of my apartment. I had just finished a high-intensity workout, the kind that leaves your muscles humming with a dull ache and your mind sharp as a bayonet. My home was my sanctuary, a small but meticulously organized space where every item had its designated place, a reflection of the 12 years of discipline I had given to the Air Force. The air still carried a faint trace of the gun oil I'd used earlier, a scent that usually brought me peace, but that peace was shattered at exactly 5:15 p.m. by a frantic, rhythmic pounding on my front door. I did not need to look through the peephole to know who it was. When I opened the door, I was met with the full force of the Carver family. My father Harold, my mother Patricia, and my sister Vivian. They did not wait for an invitation. They pushed past me into my living room like an invading force. Their faces were flushed with a mixture of panic and greed. It turned out that Derek Hartwell, the billionaire CEO Vivian was so desperate to impress, had his security team perform a routine background check on the family. They had found the name Macie Carver linked to a massive private trust, and suddenly, the daughter they had discarded 5 days ago was the most important person in their world. Vivian was the first to speak, her voice trembling with entitled rage. She looked around my modest apartment, her nose wrinkling as if she had stepped into a stable. She asked what that terrible smell was, suggesting it was either gun oil or the stench of poverty. Her eyes landed on my service dress uniform hanging neatly on the wall, and she let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She told me I was still obsessed with that blue rag, claiming it made me look like a glorified janitor and that my life of service was an embarrassment to the family's new social standing. My mother stepped forward, her voice dripping with a fake, manipulative sweetness that made my skin crawl. She told me that since I clearly did not have the elite mindset required to handle such a large sum of money, I should hand over the management of the trust to her and Vivian. She actually had the nerve to say that family comes first, right after she had banned me from the Thanksgiving table. I stood there, my feet shoulder-width apart and my hands clasped behind my back in a modified parade rest. I watched them with the cold, analytical gaze I used when inspecting a faulty engine. They did not see a daughter or a sister. They saw a roadblock between them and $15,200,000. Vivian screamed that I was being a selfish, jealous robot who was trying to sabotage her future with Derek. She claimed I was only holding on to the papers because I was bitter about her beauty and success. I looked her directly in the eye, my voice low and steady. I told her that I was not sabotaging anything. I was simply performing the duty our grandmother had entrusted to me. I told her that my mission was to ensure the resources were used with integrity, and that her history of spending money like water proved she had failed the basic requirements of the trust. The atmosphere in the room turned toxic. My father, who usually stayed silent during these outbursts, told me I was being unreasonable and that I owed it to the family name to sign the transfer papers immediately. My mother's face twisted into a mask of pure spite as she realized her manipulation was not working. She threatened to cut me off entirely, telling me that I would never be welcome in their home again if I did not comply. Vivian smirked, adding that even if I kept the money, I would still be a loser in a cheap apartment. She told me that tomorrow night at the Beacon Hill Winter Gala, she and Derek would be sitting in the VIP section, a place where people like me, rigid, unrefined soldiers, were not even allowed to walk the halls. I felt a small, cold smile touch my lips. I reached into my gym bag on the counter and pulled out the heavy, gold-embossed envelope Margaret had given me. I laid the invitation on the table between us. I told them that as it happened, I had already been invited to the gala as the anonymous founding sponsor of the entire event. The silence that followed was absolute. I saw the color drain from Vivian's face and my mother's eyes go wide with a mixture of shock and dawning horror. They realized in that moment that the person they had pushed into the shadows was the one who owned the very stage they were planning to dance on. I walked over to the front door and opened it wide. I did not raise my voice, but I used the tone of command that my airmen knew never to question. I told them to leave my home immediately. I informed them that the time for negotiation had passed and that we would conclude our business at the rally point tomorrow night. As they stumbled out of the door, still dazed by the revelation, I closed it firmly and locked the deadbolt. For the first time in my life, I felt the heavy weight of their expectations fall away. I was no longer the invisible daughter, I was the commander of my own destiny. And tomorrow, the world would finally see the true value of the woman they had tried to hide. The silence of Saturday morning was different than the lonely quiet of Thanksgiving night. This was the silence of a staging area before the first light of a major operation. I stood in front of my open closet looking at the garments that represented the two halves of my soul. On the left hung my Air Force service dress, its blue fabric crisp and its silver buttons gleaming with a history of 12 years of dedication. It would have been easy to wear my mess dress to the gala, to walk into that room with my rank and my medals on full display, using the authority of the United States government as my shield. But as I ran my fingers over the fabric, I knew that was not the path for tonight. I did not want to hide behind my uniform or use my service as a weapon to make them feel small. I wanted them to face me as the woman they had spent 32 years trying to diminish. I reached for the garment on the right, a floor-length gown of deep midnight black. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design with clean architectural lines that mirrored the precision of my technical training. The fabric was heavy and unforgiving, draping over my frame in a way that highlighted the strength of my shoulders and the athletic discipline of my body. There were no sequins, no lace, and no desperate cries for attention like the outfits Vivian favored. This dress did not ask for permission to be in the room. It commanded the space through sheer presence alone. It was my version of military chic, a blend of high fashion and tactical intent. Once I was dressed, I sat at my small vanity table and opened a velvet jewelry box that had arrived by courier from the gala committee. Inside, resting on a bed of white silk, was a small circular pin crafted from polished 24-karat gold. In the center, etched with surgical precision, were the words, "Founding Sponsor." This was the physical manifestation of the $50,000 anonymous donations I had made every year since my grandmother passed away. It was a badge of honor for a mission of mercy that no one in my family knew existed. I picked up the pin and felt its weight in my palm. For 5 years, I had kept this part of my life in the shadows, content to help my fellow veterans without seeking a single word of praise. I had allowed my mother and sister to believe I was struggling on a government salary while I quietly funded the very ballroom they were so desperate to enter. I pinned the gold circle to my left breast, exactly where I would normally wear my primary maintenance badge. It was a symbol of my transition from a silent observer to a woman of action. This was the weapon they would never see coming, because they had never looked deep enough to see the heart of the person who was providing their lifestyle. The quiet of the room was interrupted at exactly 11:15 a.m. by the ringing of my phone. The screen showed my father's name, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old vulnerability. I answered and heard Harold Carver's voice, thin and trembling as if he were speaking from a great distance. He started by apologizing for the scene at my apartment the day before, but he quickly shifted into the familiar language of appeasement. He told me that my mother was in a state of nervous exhaustion and that Vivian was terrified Derek would find out about the trust and think she had lied about her independent wealth. He asked me with a soft desperation if I would just consider making a small concession for the sake of the family. He suggested that maybe I could just sign a temporary management agreement to calm things down, and then we could discuss everything like adults after the gala. As I listened to him, I realized that his weakness was the soil in which my mother's cruelty had grown. His desire for peace at any price had been paid for with my dignity for 3 decades. I told him that I loved him, but that his cowardice had allowed our family name to be dragged into the mud of greed and deception. I told him that I was done being the invisible foundation for their lies, and that tonight, I would be reclaiming the respect that was owed to the Carver name. I hung up the phone and felt a strange sense of mourning for the man I used to look up to, but it was quickly replaced by an unshakable resolve. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the transformation was complete. I stood before the full-length mirror in my bedroom, looking at a version of Macie Carver that I had never allowed myself to fully inhabit. My hair was pulled back into a sleek low knot, and I had traded my combat boots for heels that felt like daggers against the floor. I did not use heavy makeup to hide my features, But instead, I chose a deep crimson lipstick that stood out against my pale skin and the dark fabric of my dress. My eyes, which had spent a decade scanning horizons for threats, were now focused on a much more intimate target. I looked at the gold pin on my chest, and then at the reflection of the woman who had survived the desert and the betrayal of her own blood. I leaned closer to the glass and whispered a mantra I had used before every major technical evaluation and every difficult deployment. I told myself to be calm, to be confident, and to maintain total control. I reminded myself that the objective was set and that there was no room for hesitation. I grabbed my clutch, which contained the trust documents and the gold invitation, and walked out of my apartment for the last time as the invisible daughter. I climbed into my old Ford F-150 and drove toward the lights of the Harrington Plaza Hotel, where the elite of Boston were gathering. I knew that when I walked through those doors, the era of my silence would be over and the battle for the soul of my family would truly begin. Have you ever had to find the courage to stand up for yourself when everyone else expected you to stay small? If you are ready to see Macie take back her power, please type the word warrior in the comments below. Like this story if you believe that true strength is found in discipline and character rather than just a designer label and a bank account. Your support helps me share these stories of resilience and let me know you are standing with Macie as she enters the ballroom. The Harrington Plaza was a monument to old money and carefully curated reputations. At 7:30 p.m., the street outside was a parade of black sedans and Italian sports cars. I pulled my rusted Ford F-150 into the middle of that glittering line, the engine's growl sounding like a protest against the silence of the elite. I watched through the windshield as a valet in a tailored uniform hesitated, his eyes darting from my dented fender to the pristine marble of the entrance. I stepped out of the truck, my heels clicking against the pavement with a sound like a hammer hitting a firing pin. I handed him the keys and met his gaze with the steady, unblinking eyes of a technical sergeant who had managed million-dollar flight lines. I did not apologize for the truck, and I did not look for permission to be there. I adjusted the fabric of my black gown, feeling the weight of the founding sponsor pin on my chest, and walked toward the gilded doors. The air inside the lobby was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the kind of perfume that costs more than a month's salary for most people. I felt the familiar weight of being an outsider, but tonight I was not a guest. I was the architect of the evening. As I moved through the foyer, the whispers began. I could see the guests in their sequins and silks glancing at me, trying to place my face or my name in their mental social registers. My posture was my weapon. Shoulders back, chin level, a living embodiment of the military discipline that my mother had claimed would ruin the atmosphere. I walked into the grand ballroom where 1,000 crystal prisms caught the light, creating a shimmering haze over the crowd. In the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of sycophants, was Derek Hartwell. And right beside him, looking like a porcelain doll in a dress I'd indirectly paid for, was Vivian. My mother and father stood close by, basking in the reflected glow of Derek's status. When Patricia's eyes finally landed on me, I saw her entire body stiffen. The glass in her hand wobbled as her face transitioned from a practiced social smile to a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She broke away from the group and marched toward me, her heels stabbing at the carpet as if she were trying to puncture my resolve. She reached me before I could say a word, her voice a lethal hiss that she kept low to avoid a public scene. She asked me what the hell I was doing there and told me that she had explicitly ordered me to stay away. She claimed that I was trying to embarrass the family in front of the most important donors in the city, and that my presence was an act of pure sabotage. I did not flinch. I looked at her with the cold detachment I used when assessing a failed component. I told her that this was a public event and that she did not have the authority to bar me from a room she did not own. This only served to incense her further. Behind her, Vivian had noticed the commotion. She clutched Derek's arm, her face twisting into a look of feigned terror. I watched as she whispered into Derek's ear, her lips moving quickly as she painted a picture of me as the unhinged, obsessed older sister who had been stalking her for years. She was playing the victim, turning my years of quiet support into a narrative of mental instability. The tension in the room began to thicken like smoke. My mother, seeing Vivian's performance, decided to finish what she had started. She signaled to a pair of large security guards standing near the champagne fountain. She pointed a trembling finger at me and told them that there was an intruder who was harassing the guests. She demanded that they remove me immediately, her voice rising just enough to draw the attention of the surrounding elite. The guards moved in, their expressions professional but firm. For a moment, I felt the old familiar sting of being the invisible daughter, the one who was easily discarded when she became an inconvenience. But then I remembered the file in my clutch and the gold circle on my breast. I did not move. I did not shout. I simply stood my ground as the guards reached for my arms. I reached up with my right hand and adjusted the gold pin, ensuring it was perfectly level and catching the full brilliance of the chandelier above us. Derek Hartwell, who had been watching the scene with a look of confused concern, suddenly froze. His eyes, trained by years of high-stakes venture capital to notice the smallest details of power and influence, locked onto the gold circle on my chest. He saw the two words etched into the 24-karat surface: founding sponsor. He knew exactly what that pin meant. He knew that the person wearing it was one of the 3 individuals whose anonymous contributions had saved this charity from bankruptcy 5 years ago. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out to stop the security guards before they could touch me. His voice rang out across the ballroom, commanding and clear, telling everyone to wait. He ignored Vivian's confused protests and walked directly toward me, his gaze never leaving the pin. He stated for everyone to hear that the guards were making a grave mistake because I was wearing the insignia of a founding sponsor. The ballroom fell into a stunned silence as my mother and sister looked at the gold pin and then at the billionaire they were so desperate to impress, their world of lies beginning to crumble under the weight of the truth. The ballroom of the Harrington Plaza felt as though the very air had been vacuumed out of it, leaving a heavy, pressurized silence that made every heartbeat feel like a drum in my chest. Derek Hartwell did not move quickly, but his movement was deliberate, a predatory grace that ignored Vivian's desperate, clawing grip on his sleeve. He walked past the security guards who were frozen in place and stopped exactly 2 feet in front of me. His eyes locked onto the gold circle pinned to my midnight black gown. In the high-stakes world of Boston finance, that badge was not just jewelry. It was a mark of absolute sovereignty, reserved only for the 5 individuals who had fundamentally anchored this foundation through its darkest years. Derek did not look at my mother or my sister. Instead, he inclined his head in a rare gesture of genuine deference, a billionaire acknowledging an equal. He spoke in a voice that carried to the furthest corners of the room, thanking me for my silent, strategic support over the last 5 years and stating that the organization would have ceased to exist without my intervention. He then offered his hand, and as I took it, the contrast was absolute. His skin was smooth and manicured, while my palm was etched with the rough calluses and scars of 12 years of military labor. I introduced myself as Macie Carver, and I felt the tectonic plates of my family's reality begin to shift and crack. The sound of my last name seemed to strike Derek like a physical blow. He slowly pulled his hand back and turned to face Vivian, his expression transforming into something cold and analytical, the look of a man who had just discovered a massive deficit in a balance sheet. He repeated the words Vivian had used earlier, asking her if this was the sister she had described as a failed soldier, a penniless burden, and a coarse intruder who had no right to be in this room. He pointed to the gold pin and stated that the woman she had just tried to have arrested was currently funding the very gala Vivian was using to boost her social status. Vivian stood there with her mouth open, the color draining from her face until she looked like a ghost in a designer dress. She began to stammer, claiming there must be some mistake or a gross misunderstanding. But the lie was too thin to cover the truth. My mother, Patricia, rushed forward in a frantic attempt to salvage the situation, her voice trembling with a mix of terror and misplaced arrogance. She suggested to Derek that I was simply misusing the inheritance from my grandmother, Eleanor, and that the family was in the middle of a private dispute regarding the management of those funds. In her desperation to blame me, she had accidentally confirmed the existence of the very wealth Vivian had tried to hide from Derek to maintain her image of a self-made socialite. Just as the chaos threatened to boil over, the crowd parted for a second time, and Margaret Caldwell stepped into the center of the lights with a glass of champagne in her hand and a look of sharp, legal satisfaction. She did not raise her voice, but her words cut through my mother's frantic excuses like a surgical blade. Margaret corrected my mother directly, stating for the entire room to hear that not a single cent of the foundation money had come from an inheritance. She revealed that for 5 years, every dollar I donated was sourced from my own hard-earned military salary and the combat bonuses I had received while serving my country. Then she turned her attention to the thick blue folder she was carrying and looked at Vivian with the eyes of a judge. She addressed me as the trustee and asked if I wished to sign the annual disbursement report for the $15,200,000 trust right there in front of the witnesses. She pointed out that based on the current evidence of financial irresponsibility and personal deception, the beneficiary, Vivian Carver, was in total violation of the trust's moral and fiscal clauses. Margaret asked if I wanted to finalize the suspension of all funds tonight or wait until the official deadline on Monday. The ballroom fell into a silence so profound that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. Derek Hartwell looked at Vivian one last time, but there was no longer any affection or interest in his gaze, only the profound disgust of a man who had been used as a pawn in a cheap game. He stated that he had built his career on the essence of trust, and that Vivian had shown she possessed none of it. He told her that he had no interest in being a trophy for a family built on the exploitation of their most honorable member. He then turned back to me and nodded once, a gesture of final respect, before walking away and leaving Vivian standing alone in the center of a circle of judging eyes. I looked at my mother, whose social world had just collapsed into a pile of ash. I told her that she had been right about one thing. My uniform and my rigid military ways were indeed not a fit for her table. However, I pointed out that as the person who actually owned the chair she was sitting in and the very air she was breathing in this ballroom, I was the only person in the room who had the true authority to decide who stayed and who left. I turned my back on them, feeling the absolute weight of my own dignity restored, and walked toward the exit. I left them there in the middle of the room they had fought so hard to conquer, now nothing more than a cautionary tale for the very elite they had tried to impress. The air in the grand lobby of the Harrington Plaza felt heavy and stagnant, a stark contrast to the sparkling celebration that was still continuing just a few yards away in the ballroom. As I stood near the towering marble columns, I watched the immediate fallout of the truth I had finally unleashed. Derek Hartwell did not raise his voice, but his words were like shards of ice cutting through the humid atmosphere of the foyer. He looked at Vivian not with anger, but with a profound sense of disappointment that seemed to wither her where she stood. He told her plainly that he could never build an empire with a partner who built her life on a foundation of lies. He asked her how he could ever expect her to respect him or their future together when she showed such a staggering lack of respect for her own blood. Vivian did not apologize. Instead, she let out a jagged, hysterical scream, pointing a trembling finger at me and shrieking that I had destroyed her life. My mother, Patricia, stood like a statue carved from salt, the realization finally sinking in that she had lost everything in a single hour: her billionaire son-in-law, her social standing, and the illusion of control she had maintained over me for 32 years. By 9 a.m. on Monday morning, the setting had shifted from the opulence of the hotel to the sterile, professional quiet of Margaret Caldwell's office. I sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table, the position of authority that I had earned through years of silent discipline and the foresight of my grandmother. Vivian and my mother sat across from me, their eyes red and their shoulders slumped, stripped of the designer armor they usually wore to shield themselves from reality. I did not feel a sense of petty triumph. I felt the heavy, somber weight of a commander delivering a final set of orders. I pushed a set of legal documents across the table and informed them that I was officially suspending all disbursements from the Eleanor Carver Trust for the next 12 months. I told Vivian that her days of being a professional socialite were over. For the next year, she would be cut off from every cent of the trust. She was required to find a job, any job that paid an honest wage, and she was required to enroll in and complete a comprehensive financial management course. I told her she needed to earn an A in the program and prove she understood the value of a single dollar before I would ever consider giving her access to $15,200,000 again. Vivian erupted in a fit of desperation, slamming her fists against the table and screaming that I was insane and that I was trying to kill her by forcing her to live like a commoner. I did not flinch. Instead, I brought my own hand down on the table with a sharp, resounding crack that silenced the room instantly, a gesture of command that I'd used on many flight lines to regain control of a chaotic situation. I told her firmly that I was not killing her, I was saving her from herself. I reminded her that our grandmother had seen this day coming long ago. I told her that if she did not learn how to earn and respect $1, she would never be capable of holding on to millions. I informed her that these were my final orders as the trustee. She could either accept the discipline and the path to maturity, or she could walk away and lose her entire inheritance forever. Vivian collapsed into a chair, her sobs no longer performative, but born from the absolute realization that her era of manipulation had reached a dead end against the wall of my resolve. As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, my father, Harold, lingered behind in the hallway. He looked at me with eyes that were tired and filled with a regret that had been decades in the making. He took a shaky breath and told me he was sorry, admitting that his own cowardice and his desire for an easy peace had allowed my mother and sister to treat me like a stranger in my own home. He told me that I looked so much like his mother in that moment, that I had her steel and her unwavering sense of justice. I felt a pang of sadness for the man he could have been, but I did not reach out to hug him. I knew that healing would take more than a single apology. I simply nodded and told him that I heard him, but that he needed to go home and finally be a father to Vivian instead of just a financier for her whims. I watched him walk toward the elevator, his head bowed, realizing that while I had reclaimed my dignity, the family I once knew was gone, replaced by a new and difficult boundary that I would never allow them to cross again. By December 24th, the city of Boston was buried under a thick, silent blanket of white snow that seemed to muffle the echoes of the past year. Inside my small apartment, there were no marble fireplaces or crystal chandeliers, but the air was warm and heavy with the scent of gingerbread cookies and the sharp, clean fragrance of a fresh pine tree. I sat on my worn sofa, watching the flickering lights reflected in the window pane. Around me, the room was filled with the sounds of genuine laughter and the comfortable clinking of glasses. Rachel Torres was there, wearing a ridiculously bright holiday sweater, along with 3 other airmen from our squadron who could not make the trip home to their own families. We were not wearing designer gowns or stiff military dress. We were in flannels and wool socks, sharing a collection of mismatched chairs and floor cushions. We raised bottles of inexpensive beer and told stories that only soldiers truly understand. Stories of long nights on the flight line, the shared fear of a desert storm, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the dust of a deployment. Looking at them, I realized that this was the true elite of the soul. These were the people who knew my worth without needing to see a bank balance. For the first time in my 32 years, the crushing weight of being the invisible daughter had been replaced by a profound sense of belonging. I was not a liability or a tool for social climbing. I was simply Macie, a friend, a mentor, and a member of a family I had chosen for myself. The comfortable hum of the party was interrupted by the soft vibration of my phone on the wooden coffee table. I hesitated for a moment, my mind flashing back to the cold commands of Thanksgiving, but I picked it up anyway. It was a message from Vivian. There were no demands for money and no frantic pleas for me to fix a crisis. Instead, there was a single photograph. It showed Vivian standing behind a counter at a busy Starbucks near the city center, her hair tucked into a simple green visor and her face devoid of the heavy makeup she usually wore like armor. She looked exhausted, her shoulders slumped and a smudge of milk foam on her cheek, but her eyes held a spark of reality I'd never seen before. Below the image, she had written that it was her 3rd day on the job, and her feet felt like they were going to break from standing for 8 hours. She told me she had just earned her first $50 through her own labor, and that she thought she understood now why I had fought so hard for my own independence. I looked at the screen for a long time, feeling a strange tightness in my throat. I did not send a long lecture or a list of rules. I simply tapped a like on the photo and sent a small emoji of a sun rising. It was the first step of a child finally learning to walk, a tiny crack in the vanity that had consumed her life, and for the sake of our grandmother, it gave me a glimmer of hope for her future. A sudden, firm knock at the door drew me away from the group. When I opened it, a gust of freezing air and swirling snowflakes rushed in, along with my father, Harold. He stood there on the landing, his old winter coat covered in white and his eyes red from the cold. He looked smaller than I remembered, his posture no longer trying to hide behind the shadow of my mother. He did not ask to come in, and he did not make excuses for why Patricia was not with him. Instead, he reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a heavy box wrapped in old, yellowed newspaper and tied with a simple piece of twine. He handed it to me with trembling hands and told me that he had taken it from the display case while my mother was busy with her social clubs. He whispered that it had always belonged to me because I was the only Carver woman who actually understood the weight of the silver. I unwrapped the paper and felt the cold, smooth surface of Grandmother Eleanor's silver tea set. The very object that had been used as a prop for a billionaire's approval was finally back where it belonged. My father looked at me with a sad, proud smile and said that he was starting to see Eleanor in my eyes every day. He touched my hand briefly, a silent apology for the years of silence, and then turned back toward the snowy street, disappearing into the night as quietly as he had arrived. I brought the tea set into my small kitchen and placed it on the counter. I did not see it as a trophy of my victory or a symbol of wealth. I saw it as a bridge back to the only woman who had ever truly seen me. I polished the tarnished spots until the silver reflected the warm glow of the Christmas lights, and then I brewed a pot of tea, using the same blend Grandmother Eleanor used to make on Sunday afternoons. As the steam rose in soft curls, I felt a deep, unshakable peace settle over me. I sat at my table, listening to the laughter of my fellow airmen in the next room, and looked out at the silent, falling snow. I whispered a soft, "Thank you" to the memory of the woman who had given me the weapons to fight for my own life. I realized then that happiness was never about the marble halls or the approval of people who only value the clothes you wear. It was about being in a room where you are known, where you are respected, and where your seat at the table is one you built with your own two hands. Macie Carver's journey serves as a profound educational reminder that true worth is never determined by the seats others refuse to offer us at their tables. This story teaches us that prestige is not found in a billionaire's approval or a luxury family mansion, but in the quiet discipline of one's own character and integrity. When we stop seeking validation from those who only view us as a utility or a resource, we finally reclaim the authority over our own lives. Setting firm boundaries is not an act of malice, but an essential step towards self-respect and genuine emotional survival. Stories like Macie's remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles with complex family dynamics and the search for belonging. If this journey of resilience touched your heart or gave you the strength to recognize your own value, please subscribe to our channel and like this video to support more stories like this one. We want to build a community where every voice is heard and every struggle is acknowledged. Have you ever felt like a stranger in your own home or had to fight to be seen for who you truly are? Please share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below.